I'm Vicky Johnson, and I'm joined by Sonja. We're both from the Open University Department of Geography, but I'll hand over to Sonja to get started with the presentation.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for inviting us here this afternoon. It's great to see new and familiar faces in the audience, both online and in the room. So this is good. So in the next 10 minutes in our lightning presentation, we're going to share an overview of our project that we undertook as we sort of came towards the latter part of the COVID pandemic. So I'm going to just give it a background as to why we did the project and give it some context. And then Vicky's going to sort of talk through the results and actually what we've achieved, particularly in the Open University, in terms of making a difference. Next slide, please, Vicky. Thank you. So just to give you some contextual background, as Vicky said, we're from Geography and Environmental Studies at the Open University, but we both have a background prior to joining academia in rural development, rural policy, sort of fair access to services in those non-urban settings. And distance education does lend itself in principle to widening opportunities for those that are not necessarily in easy access of a brick location for their education. However, and even Lembani and others in 2020, identified this, that online education, distance education through the online platforms gives great opportunity for others, greater inclusion. However, they noted, and others, that actually there is a barrier to online education in rural areas because of connectivity. So this project is within digital inclusion, and we recognise that there's various elements to digital inclusion, which is important, that it's around access to the equipment and the affordability of the equipment, such as a laptop or a mobile device. It's also around the skills and being able to actually use the devices, and that's part of inclusivity. And also around whether actually, do they have connectivity because of where they live? This is around the infrastructure, around the government infrastructure and private partnerships investing in infrastructure. And that's the focus of our project. It's not dismissing any elements of digital inclusion. We just focus on this one area. And that's what Lembani and others found in 2020. But just to put it into some context, in 2017, Philip Patel found that in rural areas, and this is UK, we're sort of focusing on the UK, that the broadband speeds were only 2 megabytes per second, whereas actually the government's target is 24 millibytes per second. So you can already see that there's a huge difference. What's also worth noting for those in rural areas, or for anybody, not just rural areas, but the way it works is that those grey boxes that you can see in the bottom left-hand side of our slide, the further you're away from those boxes, the slower the speed becomes. So once you hit beyond 1.2 kilometers, that speed starts to slow. So if you're only on 2 millibytes per second and you're more than that 1.2 kilometers away, you're going to start to see a decline in connectivity stability. There is a target to have all new build houses with this high speed connectivity by 2033, but that's across the whole of the United Kingdom. And in 2019, a couple of years after Philip Patel's work, the House of Lords found that over 10% of rural premises could not access broadband quicker than 10 millibytes per second. And this is comparing to other areas, so the urban areas, which are sort of looking at 24 millibytes per second. We can all sort of know whether we live in urban or less urban settings, and we know how the speeds can dip in and out. So this was sort of sort of our sort of awareness, Vicky and I, aware of this because of our research and our previous work before academia in terms of sort of fair access to services. So with the COVID pandemic, although a lot of students would have accessed their work online, they moved home. We all had to work from home. So suddenly their accessibility might have changed, because if they had previously been accessing their online studies from work or a cafe or something like that, suddenly there's a challenge. So Vicky and I were really keen to find out if, in fact, this was a problem, if there was an issue that we needed to address or to recognise, and particularly as an organisation. For those, the Open University is a Four Nations university, and we include Northern Ireland. And actually, Northern Ireland, it's a duty of public sector organisations to recognise if rural is a barrier to fair access. It's part of the Rural Needs Act of 2016. In England and Wales, it's compulsory, but it's not in law. It's slightly different. But, there is a duty that we have as an organisation. So Vicky and I decided we would actually see if, because of where students were living during the pandemic, or if because they're in rural areas, it's affecting their student experience. Next slide, please, Vicky. So we decided to survey our geography and environmental studies students. We took those that were in the second and third year equivalent, so that they had already been at the university prior to the pandemic. So there was a comparison. They knew what we might have had before, or where they had previously accessed their online materials. So we surveyed over 400 students, and we sent them a questionnaire asking about their experience and how it changed, or had it changed, and what before and during / after the pandemic, and any of the what were some of the challenges they faced, and what did they do to overcome them. We recognise that there is a weakness in our work, because of course we're assuming that they could access our survey and the email and everything that went around that. So we did exclude anyone that still had poor connectivity or limited connectivity. So we're conscious of that. So, and we got some amazing results, and Vicky's going to share those results with you and what the students have done and where we've gone with it. You on mute, Vicky.
Thank you. I can't multitask, you see. Yes, so like Sonja said, we went out to students, and there are some caveats that these may well be the more digitally connected students that we spoke to, purely because they responded. But we did look and ask them about various elements of their connectivity, both prior and during to COVID. And what really we're focusing on today is thinking about what those students managed to do. And they really did have to work through a whole range of challenges. So the idea that, the Wi-Fi flips off, broadband fails, multiple users both in the house and in the locality, meant that connections were challenging. Also, those who were reliant on mobile data, or who had been prior to COVID, because they used free Wi-Fi elsewhere, had problems with the expense of continuing to use that mobile data. When there were tutorials, when there were synchronous tutorials, there were challenges there, because students quite often got thrown out because of the connectivity. But equally, some of the asynchronous activities that our students do were really challenging, because downloading things, watching videos when you haven't got great internet speed is challenging, no matter what time you're doing it, or if you're doing it on the timetable or off timetable. Also really did flag that an idea that absolutely having other people working from home, and I think we all found that during COVID, that actually suddenly it wasn't just one or two adults at home, there were family at home studying for school or working. So that again created problems. So there was a whole range of aspects and challenges that people provided us with. But what we did find was actually how students worked around this, and this tenacity was really lovely to hear about. So they potentially copied a whole range of online module material into Word documents so they could view it offline without having to think about the broadband. And they were sometimes delayed when they were completing work, and they found that their tutor, they worked very closely with their tutors to make sure that actually if they were going to be late, people understood. So again, kind of changing that relationship potentially. Some of them also, it really extended the amount of time they were studying. So they found that actually it did delay them in terms of, well, not in terms of completing the study, but in terms of the amount of time. So if they'd been able to do it in 1 or 2 hours prior to COVID, they were finding it took 3 or 4 hours because they had to deal with the tech issues. And they also downloaded things when it was quiet, so they could watch them offline later, and worked at different times in the household. So actually avoiding those peak times when everybody else was working. And also at the other end of the scale, some of them worked around and submitted their assignments early because they were really worried about the tech failing at that last minute when they needed to submit it. So they decided to submit them early to avoid those challenges. So really quite a range of solutions that came out from the open questions that we asked them. So I think here, really working through those challenges, it was really good to see that what we need to learn from the students. They really like the added flexibility that the total online study gave them, perhaps more than when they were doing a 9-to-5 job or a shift job, because actually it meant they could dip in and out when they needed to. But there were some students who really found it wasn't ideal because it was increasing the time pressure on them. I mean, also, and this is something that I know Sonja, you'll come back to at the end, it really did raise our awareness of the challenges for our rural students with the infrastructure connectivity issues. But similarly, it wasn't just the rural students who flagged this to us. Actually, there were a range of students who found it challenging. So actually making sure that we promote what we've got available as a university to students so that we are actually supporting them as and when we need to. It also made us think about actually how we can use different approaches in module production, and we've just gone through a new qualification production within geography, so this was really relevant to making sure that things were downloadable and available offline to support students. We did appreciate the investment from government is slowly running out, but just being really aware that it's a long process. And we're both members of the Open University's Access and Participatory Digital Inclusion Group, and we've now got strategic objectives in there based on the fact that we've been able to take part in that using the results from our research. So I'll pass back to Sonja now.
Thank you. So I think just to sum up is that I think tenacity, it absolutely came through from this research, really just sort of just reinforced the hard work that students do to actually succeed, and that was through the pandemic, but just generally, and that the fact that for us as an organisation, we're now recognising that locality in terms of inclusivity around digital or online accessibility has also got to be recognised. We can't invest, we're not the government. We can't sort of invest with the government and Virgin Media, for example, to suddenly make everybody have connectivity. But what we can do is we can recognise this, and we can sort of highlight that, with our own organisation and with others, like at events like this, that online is a great solution, but there are still challenges around inclusion, one of which is around that digital connectivity. Thank you for listening. Happy to answer any questions.
Yes, Sonja, any questions? Yeah, hopefully you can hear me okay, but let me know if I need to be near the mic. Yeah, I found it, obviously I work at the OU as well, so I'm familiar with some of the problems. It's interesting people making the point about kind of copying online material and downloading it to a Word document so they can refer to it like broadband issues. And I just wonder what the kind of your impressions are of the demand for kind of printed material. Obviously, the focus is obviously on online stuff, especially at the OU. But is there still that demand from students for kind of textbooks and that kind of thing? Or is it simply about the case of having alternatives and better information to students about how to actually, you know, download this stuff?
Shall I go first, Vicky? Yeah. I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all answer, Donna. So thank you for your question. I think it's just important that alternatives still need to be considered because the inclusivity is across that range. Students still love the textbooks. That's sort of the message we hear from students. They still like having the physical textbook. But as we found from our sort of survey is that they need, online isn't the solution for all. So we just need to be mindful for that of that.
Yeah, I don't think I've got much to add to that, because equally we had students who thought it was great that they could download the textbooks and use those, which meant it was really flexible, and they commented on how they could do that prior to COVID and how they used it, but also how they continued to use it during the pandemic. So I think nothing really much to add to what Sonja was saying, other than it isn't one size fits all. Some really do struggle with only the online material, others embrace it fully, and it's just the diversity of our students, I think.
Thank you.
So, were there issues before that maybe weren't quite so highlighted around it?
Yes, it's probably the simple answer. I think sort of understanding connectivity in broadband in rural areas is, you know, it's a relatively new area, if you like, 20 odd or so years as we've kind of got more and more onto that online and having mobile signal and everything else. I think prior to the pandemic, you know, there's a lot of work around on mobile connectivity and fairness, and sort of highlighting to government. Sort of a non-academic example is, you know, is it 10-12 years ago the government wanted all claimants to be via online, but of course a lot of farmers didn't have broadband, so they couldn't access sort of farm payments and things like that. So there's a sort of a lot of discussions both in the academic community and beyond around this. I think what COVID did for education was brought it into the fore that actually it's also educational, it's also online education that is actually and the connectivity is a potential disadvantage for some students, you know, and they're now sort of checking registration at the OU, or they're going to start to sort of bring in about connectivity and find out, because of course if they've got weak connectivity, is that sort of preventing students to join our community. So I would say yes, it was around before the pandemic, but I think from an education point of view, from an online or distance education point of view, it's now really being brought to the fore.
Thank you very much. I see there's a question online as well. You can see it as well.
Yes. So, do we have any experience or advice of creating peer-to-peer learning situations in these circumstances? And I think a lot of our online work does try to facilitate those, either peer-to-peer with some tutor input or peer-to-peer without, such as through we've got, and I haven't been involved in it, but some very good peer-to-peer mentoring events that take place in closed forums, if you like. We also, what we do find though is quite often students do create those opportunities themselves. So at the moment, some of our modules don't have any face-to-face opportunities to meet, and yet students are still very much in touch with each other, kind of external to the the OU setup. So things like forums are kind of fairly something that we use quite regularly, and having tutor group forums where you don't actually need, or tutor group meeting rooms where you don't actually need a tutor presence is another opportunity, and also protects the individuals from us sharing any of their information.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think this is super important to keep in mind when we design the courses, because often the aspects we're talking about, I think that personally I have to say I forget about that some people might not be able to connect simultaneously or not as easily. So yeah, offering alternatives is a really important thing. Thanks a lot. I think we'll move on to the next presentation, I guess.